We're going to move now into the session on HCA challenges and solutions. And our first talk will be on data privacy.
Morning. So I'm going to talk about GDPR, which I know is everybody's favourite topic. So I'm Sarion, I'm the head of policy at the Sanger Institute, and I've been coordinating the GDPR task force within the HCA that reports up to the ethics working group. So I thought I'd start off with just a brief introduction to what GDPR is, or kind of the rationale of it a little bit. So initially, it was proposed as an update to the Data Protection Directive that had originally come in 1995. So it was felt around 2012 that there was a need to update the data protection laws in the EU. The idea was to strengthen the rights of individuals whose data was being processed. There was a big change around the requirement to be transparent about processing. So companies and organizations processing personal data had to kind of be a bit more open about what they were doing and what the rights of individuals were. And the idea was to try and harmonize all of this legislation across the EU. But primarily, the legislation really was focused around insurance, marketing, and kind of commercial uses of data. It wasn't so much about research. So this legislation was proposed in 2012, and if we cast our mind back to what the world looked like in 2012, it was quite a different place. Malala Yousafzai, that was the year she was shot. We had Mitt Romney, feels like a very different world. And then actually I thought this headline here about the phone hacking scandal, which is a very different kind of way of, there's a sort of data thing in there, but it feels very different from the way that we maybe get at individuals now if we're acting slightly nefariously. And of course, because we're in Barcelona, I thought the fresco disaster, the woman who repainted the valuable painting, was a good one. And of course, genomics look quite different. So there was a headline that there was a symposium that featured genomics. That was big news in 2012. We had the pig genome, we had the gorilla genome, nanopore was just coming on the market, and the 1,000 Genomes Project was getting underway. And so this was kind of the world that this data protection legislation was being proposed in. And everything was going along quite well until this guy, Edward Snowden, came along. And he, obviously, most people know that he whistle-blew about the NSF in the US. And this caused a lot of panic and a lot of sort of thinking around what uses data is being put to. And the European Parliament, who had been reviewing the proposed legislation at that time, kind of cracked down pretty hard, and they initially proposed some fairly stringent or very stringent rules around the use of consent for processing personal data. And they basically said that you need to get permission every single time you wanted to use someone's data, which doesn't really work very well for science. So there was a lot of wrangling, and it took a long time, but in 2015 they finally agreed some legislation that was a bit more sensible. It relaxed this sort of view around consent, but I think there's still, as a result, a lot of confusion around consent. There's a lot of confusion around GDPR as a whole. And so now we find ourselves in 2019 with this new piece of legislation that's still quite untested. And the world's really changed from 2012. I mean, we're now talking about, using big data to disrupt democracy. We have complex challenges like the Google DeepMind issue in the UK, which is where Google DeepMind collaborated with an NHS hospital. And, this was not, the reason why I put this one up is because actually the feeling was that the proposals and what they wanted to do were good things, but the way they did it was not done well. And so that comes into, we have to be really careful about how we use people's data and how we set up the processes and how we communicate. And then I just put in a final one about government nudging, so this idea of how we can change behaviours by using big data. And of course, we're genomics in 2019. In the UK, we're planning to sequence 5 million genomes within the health service. The Human Cell Atlas is underway. And we have the Earth Biogenome Project. And these are all huge projects. They all have enormous complexities around them, and they all have legislative and regulatory requirements that are quite challenging. So what does all of this have to do with HCA? Well, for the first time, genetic data was included in the definition of personal data in GDPR. So this is Article 4 that defines personal data. And you can see genetic, the word genetic is in there on the bottom line. And they give a further definition of what genetic data means. And it looks, it looks like quite a sensible definition. I mean, that's what probably is a lawyer's definition, but I think it's, most of us would recognize it as a definition of genetic data. But it's really difficult because not all genetic data makes someone identifiable, and some of it has to be anonymous. And so there is a real question around what genetic data is personal data. And if your genetic data is personal data, you then have to find a lawful basis for processing. So you have to have a legal reason that allows you to process the data. And so HCA finds itself in this world of, is its data personal data? And if it is, what are the things that it needs to do in order to be able to legally continue processing that data? So in November last year, HCA set up a task force. So we've been going for 11 months. I think we wrapped up basically yesterday, so we will be moving into a new phase. But the group was commissioned to basically understand GDPR in the context of HCA and come up with some high-level recommendations for how to proceed. And so what we did is we wrote a briefing, and we hired a law firm called Bird & Bird, and we basically asked them a series of questions of which data on the DCP is personal data. So this is data types, not going through and asking every single data set, is it or isn't it? So which one is personal data and covered by GDPR? Who is or are the data controllers of the DCP? So this is who are the people who ultimately, under GDPR, have responsibility for the data. What is the lawful basis for processing? So what is the reason that we're allowed to use for processing all of this data? And how do we streamline data controllership? I'm not sure why it's gone off the end, but how do we streamline this data controllership? So how do we make sure that there's a streamlined and functioning management of the data? And I should say I have put DCP in every single line on this because this was very much about the DCP. This was not about everybody in the HCA and telling them how to process data under GDPR. So it's been quite a fun year, I'll say. So we've worked fairly hard. So the current position is that data from healthy deceased, which is an oxymoron, I realise, but healthy deceased EU citizens is not covered by GDPR. Genetic data from diseased or living EU donors is potentially personal data, and we've decided mostly for future-proofing reasons, that actually we will treat it as personal data, which does not mean that it all has to be locked down and it can never be accessed, but we will need to put in place some processes to ensure that we're complying with GDPR. I think one of the biggest issues has been that currently all of the organisations represented on the OC and the DCP governance group could be considered data controllers. So this is a lot of organisations, and it's not it's a slightly unwieldy way of trying to manage the data and leaves a lot of people with responsibilities that they maybe hadn't considered. And we also initiated something called a data protection impact assessment, which basically is a sort of risk assessment for privacy. And that's currently underway, and we'll come up with some recommendations around mechanisms for the DCP to protect data. So these will be things like registered access mechanism and things like that. So our final piece of work to do is we will be making recommendations on which lawful basis we will be using to process personal data. And there will be some consideration that will be based partly on the data controllership issue and where if we change the governance structure, whether the jurisdiction of that governance structure will impact on the choice of lawful basis. We will be making some proposals within the concept of GDPR compliance about how you could streamline and simplify data controllership. This may not be the way the HCA chooses to go because there are bigger issues. GDPR can't dictate everything. And we also made some recommendations about wrapping up the task force because we felt that we'd done what we were set up for, but we will be ensuring that there's a small working group that can support GDPR expertise within the HCA going forward. So I just wanted to do a few final points around HCA and GDPR. So these are the kind of things that if you don't care anything about GDPR, these are the 4 things. So why have we focused on GDPR? This is an international consortium. There are privacy frameworks all around the world, and it has been a question of why have we put so much energy into GDPR in particular. And it is purely because GDPR is a brand new piece of legislation. It is extremely complex. It's untested at the moment. We have a reasonably good understanding within HCA of other privacy frameworks. This was purely to try and map our way out through this new piece of legislation. It is not to say that this is the only piece of legislation that needs to be followed. We also need to think about data contributors and users, and scientists need to take responsibility for ensuring that they are compliant with local rules and requirements, including GDPR. And so we will be trying to put out some communications. Part of our strategy for the lawful basis will involve advising data contributors about some of the ways that they should think about GDPR, but scientists have to ultimately take their own responsibility before they engage with the DCP. And consent under GDPR is very complicated, and different member states have taken different approaches to it. And so I would always recommend any scientist who's thinking about using consent as their lawful basis under GDPR to get some advice about it. Some of the data, because I think this is something that's maybe not been communicated that much, some of the data will not be fully open, but we're still looking at the mechanisms for access. So this is not necessarily a full managed access process in which there will be data access committees and big data access agreements. We're probably looking at something like a registered access mechanism, which will be much lighter touch, but will allow oversight of who's accessing the data. It will require some agreement to terms and conditions, but nothing too heavy-handed. And then the final point is that although we've spent an enormous amount of time looking at GDPR and people have worked really hard to try and work our way through this, it mustn't shape the way HCA goes. HCA is a wonderful grassroots organisation, and it needs to shape itself and in the process try and be GDPR compliant, but not let GDPR shape everything. So that has been a slightly whistle-stop tour through what we've done on GDPR. I really have to thank Katrina, James, Emily and Sean, who've done so much work to get us where we are, and I also have to thank Tracy, who I could not have done this without her helping. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
First of all, I guess I'd like to say thank you for all of your efforts in this. This is really an important thing.
Yep.
And maybe I could ask the first question, which is, if you sort of look at the landscape, do you think that other countries are going to start to adopt similar regulations?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I think people are very worried about GDPR and they're scared of it. I actually don't think it's that bad a piece of legislation. It's just a bit complicated, and you have a complicated piece of legislation and a complicated project, and that squares the complexity, I think. So I don't see it at the moment, but yes, I think some of the aspects they will take on. I think one of the reasons why, because nobody really took the Data Protection Directive that seriously, which is one of the reasons why we're now having problems, because actually people weren't compliant with the previous bit of legislation, and now the step up is that much bigger. I think what the Commission, what the European Union did, was with having criminal, so there are criminal elements now that probably wouldn't impact on scientists, but also the fines now mean that people are taking it much more seriously, and I could see that definitely coming in. So yes, I see probably a strengthening of data protection. Yep.
Thank you. Aviv?
I mostly want to make a comment because of the context of talks yesterday.
Yep.
I think in several of especially in the breakout session, report backs, and in other settings, people said, well, we hear about the data and the data is still not in the DCP. I wanted to highlight to people that the DCP currently is GDPR compliant by simply not having any data inside it that comes from samples that would require GDPR. And as a result, samples that have already been collected in the community that would require this extra layer of control simply cannot go in for the time being. And that's why, there was a sense of urgency in this group of people who has done a fantastic job on the task force. But also, I think everyone will have to bear a little bit in terms of patience around this because it's a new world.
Yeah. And there's someone...
I'm just interested in what the definition of a European person is, since that's probably fluid. Right?
Yes, it is fluid. So it would be an EU citizen or someone living within the EU is generally how that's taken. So
At the point of time of data collection, or
it's fluid because, I mean,
so potentially any of us could be Europeans at some point in time.
well, if an organisation, so this museum at the moment, all of the data that's collected from you, from wherever you come from, would be covered by GDPR right now. But when you leave and go back to your countries, they probably would still, I mean, your processes would be GDPR compliant, so you would continue managing it in that way. But yes, technically, probably the data would not be at that point. But I'm not even sure, to be honest. But yeah, I think it is fluid. And it's one of the things that we need to think about with the governance.
Right. So say you're a US citizen and your data's collected in the US as a US citizen, and then you marry somebody and move to Europe. You become a European citizen.
I don't think I think in that situation, it's the point of collection. But if you were to then transfer the data into Europe, potentially it would become, you'd be handling it in the EU. So.
Limited understanding, even if you're an EU citizen and your data is, say, you broke your leg and you went to MGH and you got treated, that's not GDPR.
Yeah.
Because it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Couldn't hear you, Aviv. Sorry.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on. So thank you again.